Again, we have the protection filter. We have the focusing ring. When you're in autofocus, it's not going to allow this ring to turn, only when you're in manual. Don't force this, you'll break it. Okay? Some lenses allow you to focus manually even when you're in auto, but those are usually the high-end Nikon and Canon lenses, not the lower-end AFS kit lenses that come with Nikon or the equivalent in Canon. Here's that larger ring that you'd grab to change the focal length, 18 being the widest, and 55 being the narrowest angle of view. So if you were going to zoom in and get close, you want to be at 55. If you want to show more of the scene, you want to go to 18. And you achieve that just by turning this knob one way or the other. Okay? There's the SD card slot. Most of our cameras, you won't be checking out cameras because you're online students, but most of our cameras don't come with cards because they get lost, but they're incredibly cheap now. So, get a 2 gig. I'm a fan of multiple lower capacity rather than one high capacity card. I figure if I lose one or corrupts, I'm going to lose a lot less images. So I tend to stay with a smaller card and have more of them, just in case. Here's the window on the back. Some more buttons over here that we'll probably get to in a minute here. Okay, all kinds of cards. We're going to be using SD cards for our D3000s, D40s, and most of your cameras are going to have some form of SD card or smaller. The compact flash card is only for the higher end pro models, and they're a heck of a lot more expensive. So probably SD cards is where you're going to go. Be careful if you have an older camera like a D440 or a D3000, and you buy a 64 gig SD card, it may not work because the camera can't handle a card that big. So be a little careful with what card you're buying. The older the camera, the smaller the card you're going to have to buy because it can't handle these super high, brand new, high capacity cards. It stops somewhere. I don't know where that is, but for that sort of class of camera, the D40, the D3000, the Rebels, a 4 or a 6 gig SD card, and 2 or 3 of them is probably all you're going to need. And it's probably going to give you a couple of thousand images, and you're probably not going to take that at any given setting. And if you did, you'd run out of batteries first. Okay. There's that little window or that little accessory compartment opened up where we have video out and USB out. If you want to download pictures from the camera onto your computer, that USB cable would work for that. You can also get a a card reader that'll allow you to do that. Download the pictures to your computer as well. That's what it looks like with the lens off. That's the mirror looking up in there. So that's, you don't have to take the lens off. That's what it looks like. Don't worry about it. So the back of the camera has a lot of settings. On the left side, you have a series of bins, and then once you get into a bin, you have a lot of controls to select. In the center, you can also see some of those icons over on the back. So autofocus, the first one, autofocus, area mode, ISO sensitivity, image quality, light balance, picture control, display mode. So all kinds of things to set. Best to look at the manual and figure out what you want to set these things to and why. If you have any questions specifically about a camera, take a picture of the back, what's troubling you, send it to me, and I can go over that with you either over the phone or we can text back and forth until we get that whole thing figured out. Most of these cameras I've had experience with in one way or another, and I can figure out where our problems are. White balance is really interesting. This allows the camera to correct for any color shift. As we're going to move through this class, you'll start understanding different lights have different color temperatures. Our eye corrects for those. The camera doesn't. In auto white balance, the camera tries. So if we select that first one, incandescent, the camera's going to say, oh, these lights are very yellow. So I'm going to change the camera and neutralize, get rid of that yellow so everything looks proper. Fluorescent, they're going to be a little green, so I'm going to fix that. Daylight, they're going to be a little blue, I'm going to fix that. Flash, I'm going to fix that. Cloudy, more blue, fix that. Shade, more blue, I'm going to fix that. So this basically allows the camera to adjust the color balance of the image. We didn't have this on film, guys. It's brand new for digital. I leave my camera on auto white balance 99% of the time. Any adjustments that I need to make on what the camera decides, I can do when I post-process the image. At least it gets me close, right, to where the color balance should be. I'll show you how to adjust those color balances later on in a demo on Lightroom. Image quality, JPEG, which you probably all know about. It's a common format. Any browser can open it. Every application can open it. It's the standard of what we ship images back and forth. Recognizable by anybody. Excuse me. You have the ability to compress it to make the image very small, or leave it very large and maintain all the data. So that's a really good choice sometimes. But you do have this compression that happens that tends to eventually eat away at the file, little by little by little. We'll talk about RAW later, but RAW basically is all the sensor data and all the color data sent to the software application that's going to view the image, and then the image is interpolated at the desktop computer application level, not at the camera level. Whereas JPEG, it's interpolated inside the camera. Okay, so RAW, more bits, bigger image, less images per card, slower frames per second because they're bigger files, but you have a lot more bits to work with on the back end. So it's a choice you have to make. ISO sensitivities. This is the sensor's sensitivity to light. The lower the number, the more light it needs to make a photograph. The higher the number, in this case 1600, the less light it needs to make a photograph. So think about that. If I'm walking around outside and the sun's out, it's a bright day around noon, I can get away with 100 ISO because there's a ton of light outside. But if I go out into that same situation after the sun's gone down and all I have is maybe some landscape lighting in the backyard and I want to take some pictures, there's not very much light, so I may choose to increase that number, right, the ISO, so it needs less light to make the picture. Now with that comes all kinds of drawbacks. Most notably is noise. The higher ISO, you get some grain, okay, or speckled pattern to the image. They're not as sharp. Pixels start clumping together to magnify that light, to intensify those photons. So in the camera adjusting its ability to see in the dark, it's making some image quality compromises. So this is where you may want to choose 100 over 1600 because of the quality, or something in between, depending on what's best going to work for you. And we're going to talk more about this later on. Metering, matrix, all over the place, center weighted, or spot. Now the metering, what happens is the camera looks at a particular area of the frame and determines, based on the ISO you set, what f-stop and shutter combination it needs to make the correct exposure. Okay, so all this does is say, I tell the camera, get the information from everywhere and average it in matrix. Or I say, camera, get the information from the center, 20%, and let's use that as our baseline. Or with spot, camera, get a very teeny spot right in the center and get all your exposure information from there. And yeah, you could guess where matrix may be worthwhile because you have a lot of different things in the scene. The spot may be important because only one teeny spot of the image has got light, and that's what you want to measure. But you also don't want to measure the hotter the shadow area, brighter the shadow area, and then forego everything else in spot meter. So it can get you in trouble. For now, I would say that matrix or center weighted seem to be the safest and the less mistakes. So here's a standard display on the back of the camera. I'll go through some of these. This is on aperture priority A. So you're going to choose the aperture. The camera is going to choose the shutter speed. And right now, given the ISO that we set, which is 100, and the light in the scene, the camera says, or I set f11, the camera says, okay, if you want to shoot it at f11, you're going to have to shoot it a quarter of a second. Okay, got that? There's your battery life. Quality, we're shooting raw. White balance is auto. ISO is 100. Single shot. Autofocus is center. I don't know what that is. This is center weighted for the focusing. And I don't know what ADL means. This is exposure compensation, either for camera or the flash. And I think this is how many pictures you have left, 110. And this is just a little diagram showing you f11, and somehow this is supposed to be a shutter speed, but that's kind of a bad dial. This is a little bit more valuable, that you can kind of get the idea that it's f11 and the size of that opening on the camera. So that's basically what this little menu item can show you. You take a picture, and there we go. There's my nice little Saab that I used to have out in front of the house. Okay, so this is kind of the same. The camera's pointing in the same direction. I went to manual, and notice the exposure's the same. Quarter f11. But we have this little scale down here. When all these little marks are gone, and all we see is 0, that's the correct exposure. Remember, in manual, I'm setting the f-stop and the shutter speed. Okay? So if I saw this, I would have 1, 2, 3, 4 dots towards the minus, which would mean it's underexposed by 2/3 of a stop. So I want to give it more light by either making the shutter speed longer or take the aperture and make it bigger by these 4 little dots or 2/3 of a stop. So this is basically, in manual, this is your light meter telling you what to set this and what to set this to make the exposure. And you can choose what this number is, and you can choose what this number is from lots of combinations. As long as in the end, right, all of these little slash marks go away and all we have is the 0 right here. That's it. Okay? Now I went from a quarter of a second to an eighth of a second, which is a shorter duration exposure. And look what happened here. Now I'm a stop and 2/3 underexposed. Because I changed it from a quarter of a second to an eighth of a second. All right. And here, if I opened it up to 1/2 a second, 0.5, they go away. Now this is the correct exposure for that scene in manual mode with average metering, right? Averaging the scene and ISO 100. If I go to a longer exposure, 1.3 seconds, I go to the plus side. And if I go to 1/25 of a second, I go way off the scale to the minus side. So this 1/, that's a fraction of a second. This one was 1.3 seconds, long duration. This was 1/125 of a second. Take a second and break it into 125 equal parts and just expose it for one of those, which is a far shorter duration than 1.3 seconds. Therefore, underexposing. As we change the dial here, okay, it appears what we're doing here. We were on manual, and the correct exposure was 1/2 a second, 0.5 at f11. We go to aperture priority. We leave it at f11. It automatically picks the same. So you can get the same exposure in manual as you could in aperture and shutter priority. It's the same amount of light, the same ISO, the same camera. It's just how much work do you want to do, and how much work do you want the camera to do? If you pay for all these fancy knobs and buttons, I say why not use them? Unlike most people, pros don't use manual, right? They use one of these automatic modes. Professional photographers don't have time to do math out in the field. We need perfect exposures all the time, and we need to be able to count on that. And the camera can make far, far less mistakes than we can, provided we've given it all the necessary information. And then here, we're back to manual. We went to 125th, and it's off the scale. We've opened it up to f45, f4.5, which means that's as large as this aperture can open up, allowing, see how this is different here? Look at that, f11, and then that, f4.5. That's wide open. Still isn't enough to give it enough light hitting the sensor for that short duration. And if I go to f25, the smallest, you can see this is a lot smaller. It's still going to be way off in the minus side, farther than we even know where it ends up there. Aperture priority at f25, the proper exposure is 2 seconds. Aperture priority. So there's lots of combinations we can use. A half a second at f11, 2 seconds at f25. They're all going to give you the same exposure, just different amount of time and intensity. And look, we're going to talk about all this stuff in detail later. This is basically just the overview. Or 1/10 of a second at 5.6 would be another combination you can use. And right, if you are here at 125 and you open it up all the way, it says it's low. You don't have enough light. Subject is too dark. Guess what? The subject's going to be dark when it says subject is too dark. So pay attention. Make these little dots go away, right? By taking this and making it longer to give it more light to make this disappear. All right, lens protection filters. It's important to use some sort of filter to protect the surface of your lens. Every single semester, a student will drop their camera, even if it's in a case. They'll bump it into a doorway. Something will happen, and the front element will come in contact with something hard. And something's got to give, and it's not going to be concrete. And about 8 times out of 10, the filter self-destructs, saving the lens surface. Heck of a lot cheaper to buy a new filter than a new lens. Also, if you're out shooting and it gets dirty, it gets windy, somebody puts their finger on your camera lens, you're shooting kids, they're putting it on the filter, not on the lens surface itself. So it basically protects that front surface of your lens. Now, some people would argue that, yeah, well, if you do this, doesn't it take away the resolution? And, maybe. I shoot with them all the time and I haven't seen a difference. If I was shooting in the studio under a very controlled situation where I know there's going to be nobody sticking their finger in my lens, or I know there's not going to be any rain or wind or dirt, I might take it off. If I was shooting night photography and I wanted to get some of the flare and crazy things that light happens when it hits the lens, if it hits the filter first, it changes that. Doesn't make it quite as appealing. So a lot of people would take the filter off if they're trying to really use the flare going on inside the lens from light sources pointing directly at the camera. So that might be another situation where you take it off. That's what it looks like. It has a millimeter size that screws onto the front element of the lens. That's why I would take my camera to the camera shop when you buy this. Ask for a protection filter. You can pay $100 or you can pay $20. I pay $20. They work fine. Inside the lens cap, it'll give it a millimeter size. So if you don't want to take the camera down, you look inside your lens cap and it'll say 52, 55, 49, 72. That's the size of filter you need. It should screw right on there, right on the end, and then your lens cap could go right over that. Okay. Please, 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 when you buy a new lens, buy a filter. You'll find all kinds of different filters. Ultraviolet filter tends to absorb some of the blue. Back before digital, it was important to get as neutral of a scene as we can. With these days, with our post-processing tools, we can adjust for any color shift that small that pops up. So if you want to get an ultraviolet filter, by all means, that'll work. Skylight filter, same thing. Has a little bit of a red cast, but it takes away some of the blue in the camera. And we can also fix that post, or it may help, on the front end, but it's not going to have. And none of these filters have a filter factor. Any color it has is so subtle that there's no absorption of enough light to be significant to alter the exposure. Okay, well that takes care of the camera lecture for Module 2. Again, we're going to go over f-stops and shutter speeds and lenses and all that stuff, but I wanted to give you a basic overview of the digital single lens reflex camera, the one we're going to be using, some of its controls. Look at your camera, compare what you have versus what the D3000 has, and if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to help you out whenever I can.